Good evening, everybody. My name is Erica Ramos, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight for our consumer webinar. We'll be talking tonight about the future of at-home genetic testing with Scott Weissman. As I mentioned, my name is Erica Ramos. I'm the president of the National Society of Genetic Counselors, and I spend a lot of time talking about direct-to-consumer testing particularly, and have had the pleasure of working with Scott on some projects around this. So I know this is a hot topic tonight, and I think you'll get a lot of interesting information. We do encourage questions to be asked throughout the presentation. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask our speaker, please click on the question and answer tab and then type a question in the chat box. Any questions submitted during the presentation will be read aloud during the question and answer portion. By submitting a question, you are consenting to have the information contained in the question read aloud during the presentation, which is being recorded. So please do not submit any personal identifiers or names, anything like that in your submission. Also, please note, as a courtesy to the presenter, all participant telephone lines have been automatically muted. If you should experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, you can use the question and answer tab to submit any questions or concerns as well. NSGC offers a wide range of educational programming. The information provided in this presentation is not a substitute for medical or professional care, and you should not use the information in place of a visit, call, consultation, or the advice of your physician, genetic counselor, or other healthcare provider. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Scott Weissman as our speaker for this webinar. Scott graduated from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1998 with a bachelor's in biology. After graduation, he spent 2 years at the Molecular Oncology Diagnostic Lab at the University of Illinois at Chicago, developing expertise in molecular genetic techniques. He completed the graduate program in genetic counseling at Northwestern in 2002 and has spent the past 16 years working in adult genetics with an interest in direct-to-consumer genetic testing. He created his own private practice genetic counseling company called Chicago Genetic Consultants, LLC, and provides virtual genetic counseling for Genome Medical. He's active in NSGC and is a past co-chair of the Cancer Special Interest Group and was the NSGC liaison to the Commission on Cancer and National Accreditation Program for Breast Centers. So I'm going to leave you guys in Scott's good hands. Enjoy.
Thanks, Erica. It's a real pleasure to speak to everybody this evening, and I want to thank NSGC for inviting me to give this webinar with you guys. So we're going to be talking about the future of at-home genetic testing, and this is really, like Erica said at the beginning, a really kind of hot area right now. To make sure that everybody's on the same page, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on genetic testing in general, which will really set the stage for the discussion about the at-home genetic testing. We'll spend time talking about the differences between these tests, as well as the risks, benefits, and limitations. We'll simply talk about what's involved in doing an at-home genetic testing, and then we'll wrap up with really focusing on the importance of genetic counseling both before and after pursuing at-home genetic testing. And one more disclaimer before we get started. In this webinar, I'm going to be talking about specific genetic testing laboratories as well as specific genetic tests. This really shouldn't be considered an endorsement by myself or the National Society of Genetic Counselors for the laboratory or genetic test discussed. It really just helps provide a frame of reference for these different tests. And with that, let's go ahead and get started with the genetic testing primer. And for a little bit of background, again, I'm sure some of you are well aware of this, but inside the cells of your body, you have your genes, and your genes are made up of DNA. And the genes are responsible for producing a protein that your body needs to serve a specific function. And the genes and the DNA are made up of 4 chemicals, which for the purpose of this talk aren't specifically important. But essentially what a genetic test is something that can be done through a blood or saliva sample. And the analogy that I like to use is if you think of a gene like a sentence, what the genetic test is, it's like running a spell check. It's going through letter by letter, word by word, to make sure that every single word is spelled correctly and in the right place in the sentence so that when you read it, you can understand what the sentence is trying to tell you. So in this little example here, we have a simple sentence that says, the cat ate the rats. What a genetic test is doing, again, is making sure that words are spelled correctly and that all the words are there. So let's say that there's a typo. So in this example, we're going to remove the E out of the word the, and that typo would be considered a mutation because we are removing an important letter in the code. And if you remove that letter, the code really kind of has to shift and adjust to that. And what you're left with is basically gibberish. And at that point, the gene doesn't work properly. And if the gene doesn't work properly, that protein isn't produced. And then there's potentially some downstream effects in the body from that occurring. And there's really many different ways to do genetic testing, many different technologies. And I'm going to talk about two this evening because these two are the types that are typically used for at-home genetic testing. The first is something that's called genotyping. Genotyping is a genetic test that evaluates known and common mutations or variations in genes that are associated or linked to a specific disease or trait. Most genotyping tests looks at single letter changes in the genes. And we call these single letter changes single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. So throughout the talk, you're going to hear me talk about this term SNPs. So these are single letter changes in genes. And genotyping can look at hundreds to hundreds of thousands of known genetic mutations or variations. The other type of testing that's commonly used in at-home testing is something called full gene sequencing. So this is where you're taking a gene or a set of genes and reading the entire sequence of the gene, looking for a mutation. So with genotyping, you know what the mutations are. With full gene sequencing, you don't know what they are and you're looking for them. And what's a little bit different about full gene sequencing is that not only can it pick up the single letter changes like the SNPs, but it can also pick up if there's large chunks of the genetic code missing, what are called deletions, or if there's large parts of the genes that have been replicated or duplicated, called duplications. When you get results back with genotyping, there's basically two results. Either the SNP, or again, the known mutation, is either present or absent. So either you have it or you don't. And because everybody has two copies of every gene, one from mom and one from dad, if the SNP is present, you either have one copy of it from either your mom or your dad, or you have two copies of it, one from each parent. With full gene sequencing, the results are different. And there's three possible results that you can get out of a full gene sequence test. The first is that the results can be positive. Positive in this case means that a mutation or a typo was identified in a gene and that typo may be associated with a specific disease risk. There's a negative result, which means that no mutations or typos were identified. It doesn't completely rule out the possibility of a mutation being present because full gene sequencing is not 100%. It can't pick up every single type of mutation. And then sometimes the results can come back inconclusive, where a typo is found, but the laboratory isn't sure whether that typo is actually enough to disrupt the way that the gene works. And so these inconclusive results are called variants of uncertain significance, and we really don't know whether or not these type of genetic changes lead to disease or not. So with that background, let's go ahead and dive into at-home genetic testing. So at-home genetic testing is genetic testing that can be done in your home. And I know that is the Captain Obvious statement, but it really just had to be said. So some more information about it. Essentially what you do with a at-home genetic test is you contact the laboratory. Typically most laboratories have some sort of a web portal that you're ordering through. You purchase a test, and then the laboratory will send a genetic testing kit directly to your home. Almost all of these are saliva-based tests. So they will send you either a tube that you will spit into, seal it back up and send it back to the laboratory, or sometimes it may be a swab where you may swab the inside of your cheeks and then send those swabs back to the laboratory. Once the laboratory has it, they will run the genetic test that you've chosen to do. You can have results typically anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks. Some tests can actually be a little bit longer. And these are tests that typically your insurance will not cover. And this will be an out-of-pocket expense. And some of these tests can be as little as $50, and other tests can be upwards of $1,000 or more. So with at-home genetic testing, there's really two main types of tests that are really starting to emerge in the at-home genetic testing market. The first is something that is called a direct-to-consumer test. These are genetic tests that are ordered by you, the individual, without the involvement of a healthcare professional. These tests typically look at ancestry information or genetic traits, and some of them do offer some disease risk information. Other direct-to-consumer tests are more entertainment. For instance, there's a company that you can send in your DNA to, and they will print out a scarf made up of your genetic code. So some examples of companies that offer direct-to-consumer testing, 23andMe, which we'll talk about in more detail. There's something called Ancestry.com that'll give you information about your ancestral background. And here's more, I would call it an entertainment company called DNA Fit, where they have a database of genetic markers for elite athletes, and they compare your genetic markers to those of the elite athletes to see if you potentially have the genetic traits to be an elite athlete. Whether it actually works or not is really to be determined. The other main type of at-home genetic testing is really more of what we call a consumer-directed test. And the big difference here is that these are genetic tests that you may order, but it requires a healthcare professional to sign off on. So either one of your own doctors agrees to order the testing, or the laboratory may provide you with a healthcare provider to sign off on the genetic test. The consumer-directed tests are typically looking at genes known to cause a risk of a hereditary disease. And because the results can truly have an impact on your health and potential screening and management, it does require a medical professional to sign off on it. Examples of consumer-directed tests and companies are Color, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. SEMA4 recently launched a newborn screening test that looks at additional genetic conditions that most states don't look at. And there's a company called Veritas Genetics that is offering a whole genome sequencing test. In terms of the tests themselves, there's some other differences. So direct-to-consumer testing is typically using that genotyping technique that we discussed. So it's looking at known mutations or variations or these SNPs that have been linked or associated to specific diseases or traits, whereas consumer-directed testing is using the full gene sequencing technology. So they don't know of any specific mutations. They're looking to see if you have something that is maybe specific to you and your family. Direct-to-consumer companies, again, many of the SNPs are linked to disease, but they may not actually cause disease. And this is a big differentiator for many of the conditions, where some of these SNPs, if you look at people that have the disease, they may be found in those individuals, but these SNPs are also found in people that don't have the disease. So we don't necessarily know for sure that these SNPs are a one-to-one correlation to the disease that they may cause. But some of the SNPs that these companies can test for can and are known to definitely increase the risk of a certain disease, again, when we're talking about disease risk. Whereas with the consumer-directed testing, the mutations that are identified on the full gene sequencing typically are going to associate a clear increased risk of disease. And then depending upon the gene, it may actually lead to a diagnosis of a condition after an evaluation with a physician. Some other differences between the two tests: with direct-to-consumer testing, normal results don't necessarily rule out a risk. So if you were undergoing a test to look for your colon cancer risk and the SNPs come back and say that your risk of colon cancer is low, that doesn't necessarily mean that your risk is actually low, because it's not really looking at your personal medical history or your family history. And one note for Ancestry testing is that different laboratories that offer Ancestry testing look at different SNPs. So where one laboratory may tell you that you're 70% English, another laboratory may come back and tell you that you're 40% English. And again, it's because they're looking at different SNPs, and these companies have different ways of determining what percent ancestry you are based on the SNPs that they're looking at. With the consumer-directed testing, the same thing applies in the sense that if your results come back normal or negative, it lowers the risk that you may have a risk for a hereditary condition that was evaluated, but it doesn't completely rule it out, because with some of these consumer-directed tests, they're not testing for every single gene linked to that disease. And as we talked about earlier, full gene sequencing is not 100%. And again, something else that's a differentiator between direct-to-consumer and consumer-directed is that with the consumer-directed testing, you can sometimes get back those inconclusive results, those variants of uncertain significance, where it's not clear exactly what the risks are. So let's go through two examples. And the first example I'm going to show is from 23andMe. They are definitely one of the most well-known direct-to-consumer companies. And the reason that I wanted to use them as an example is that they have an Ancestry test as well as an Ancestry and Health test. So when you order their Ancestry and Health test back, if you look at the image towards the left, you will get back 5 general reports. One that will give you information about your ancestral background. One that will tell you whether or not you are a carrier for any recessive conditions. So these are conditions where both you and your partner would need to be carriers for the exact same condition, something, let's say, like cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs disease, to actually have a child with that condition. Then there is a report on the genetic health risk. So these are the conditions that actually may increase the risk of specific diseases, and we'll come back to that. There is a wellness report that may talk about how your body absorbs caffeine. And then there are trait reports. So the image to the right is an example of a trait report. And this is actually my trait report. And just to kind of highlight how this works, if you look here, this test says that in terms of one of my traits of having a bald spot, that I'm not likely to have a bald spot. And that in terms of early hair loss, I'm not likely to have early hair loss. Yet this is what I look like. So although bald is beautiful, this does make the point that genetics is not necessarily destiny. And this information, although can be useful and informative, isn't always 100% accurate. Trust me, this is not a choice, even though I'm rocking it. All right, moving along. So I want to spend a few moments talking about the genetic health risk reports that come back from 23andMe. In 2017, the FDA gave approval to 23andMe to provide disease risk reports for now 11 different conditions. The ones that are in orange are the ones that are currently being reported out by 23andMe. And the reason that I wanted to spend a few moments going through this is to understand kind of what some of the limitations are of the direct-to-consumer test. So for instance, the Alzheimer's disease looks at a specific gene called ApoE, where one of the SNPs, which is that kind of one that looks at like an E and a 4, has been linked to late onset Alzheimer's disease after the age of 65. There are lots of people walking around that have that E4 who go on to develop Alzheimer's. And there's lots of people that walk around that carry that E4 who never go on to get it. So it's one of these SNPs that's been linked to Alzheimer's disease, but we don't know for sure that it's actually causing it. Another one to point out is the BRCA1 and 2 gene. So that was recently added to the test. So that's a test that's looking at 3 specific SNPs. And these 3 specific SNPs are specific mutations that are common in people of Jewish ancestry. So if you were to take the 23andMe test, trying to find out if you have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, because you have a family history of breast or ovarian cancer, and you're not of Jewish ancestry, this would be the wrong test, because this would not be looking at these genes in their entirety. Another example to point out is Parkinson's disease. So it notes here that there are 2 total variants, or 2 SNPs, that are looked at in 2 genes linked to Parkinson's disease. However, there are well more than 10 genes that are known to potentially cause Parkinson's disease. So, if your father and his brother and your father's mother all had Parkinson's disease, this really may be the wrong test, because it's only looking at 2 mutations in 2 genes, when in fact there's potentially lots of different causes. So with these genetic health reports, it's giving you a little window into these conditions, but it's not really a full analysis for them. And one more point about direct-to-consumer testing. When you receive your report from the direct-to-consumer company, the SNPs that they are reporting out to you have been validated. That means that they've run their test over and over and over and over again to ensure that when the results say that you have a specific SNP that they're positive, that those results are accurate. And if you don't have a SNP, that too is accurate. There's only a certain subset of these SNPs that are being reported to you. Some companies will give you the opportunity to download the raw data. The raw data is basically a file of all the SNPs that were tested. So for some of these companies, we're talking about greater than 500,000 different SNPs. If you were to download that report and look at it, it's not really interpretable. You couldn't really learn anything from it. But there are these third-party websites that you can potentially upload your raw data file to that will, what we would say would be interpret the results for you. Now, a couple things to know about this, because there's a lot of savvy people out there that are doing this with getting their raw data reports. All of the other SNPs that are in the raw data that are not in your report from the laboratory typically are not validated. That means we don't know if those results are true, meaning if you are found to have certain SNPs linked to a disease, we don't know if those results are truly positive or if those are false positives. So when you take your raw data file and you run it through one of these third-party websites, when it gives you an interpretable report of your raw data, it's assuming that all the results are real. And that's not necessarily the case, because a recent study showed that when a individual interpreted their raw data, they went to a genetic counselor, something was identified in the raw data that said they may be at an increased risk for a disease. When a genetic counselor or another professional ordered a second genetic test to confirm the raw data results, 40% of the time the results were falsely positive. So again, the reliability of raw data is questionable. And really, any report that you get from a raw data file should not be acted upon until whatever you're concerned about may be validated that it's actually real. And let's move on to an example of a consumer-directed company. So there's a company called Color, and they have 4 different genetic tests that somebody can purchase. So one is a full gene sequence of the BRCA1 and 2 genes for breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. So whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, if you wanted to be tested for these genes, that would be an appropriate test. They also offer a panel of 30 different hereditary cancer genes. They offer 30 genes that are linked to certain forms of hereditary cardiac disease. So people that may have an abnormal heartbeat or rhythm, which are called arrhythmias, or potentially people that have enlarged hearts, or what are called cardiomyopathies. And then they also offer a test for people that have familial forms of very high cholesterol called familial hypercholesterolemia. So these are very complete tests. They're very thorough. But with these kind of tests, Color is not necessarily testing for all the genes known to cause these conditions. So they're not testing for every single hereditary cancer gene. They're not testing for every single hereditary cardiac gene. So it's a kind of a partial evaluation. Due to some technical issues, some of the genes on these tests may not be completely analyzed. And what's important to know is that there are lots of laboratories that offer these types of genetic tests for these specific genes, where you could potentially get more of the genes evaluated that are linked to cancer or cardiac disease, or that don't have some of the same technical issues that with some of the genes that this laboratory may have. Another separator of the consumer-directed genetic testing is that raw data is not something that the vast majority of these companies are going to have for you. You're going to get a report, and the report is going to tell you about the genes that were tested, and there's not really going to be any other data to have. So, if you took a test for hereditary cancer, but you want to know whether or not there's a risk for Alzheimer's disease, this test is not going to be able to tell you that, because they're not looking at any other genes. They're just looking at the genes that are really listed in the test that you're ordering. Now that we've gone over some of the examples and some of the differences between direct-to-consumer and consumer-directed testing, let's talk about some of the risks and benefits of at-home testing in general. So I think the first benefit that most of us see in genetics is that there is the chance that this information can potentially identify a risk of disease for an individual or family. And many times there may be a family history of whatever condition that can show up on these tests. But as we do more and more of these tests in healthy individuals, we're finding that there's a lot of people who test positive for a specific hereditary risk where they do not have a family history of disease. So this is really allowing individuals and families to really have access to early intervention, doing additional screening tests, imaging tests, blood work to try and detect some of these conditions earlier. Or for some of these diseases, there's actually certain preventative things that we can do that will prevent the disease from ever occurring. Many insurance companies, while they pay for genetic testing, many insurance companies have different criteria for when they will and will not cover genetic testing. And sometimes there's people that are really good candidates to undergo genetic testing, but for some reason they don't meet their insurance company's criteria to have it covered. So this is a good way to get that genetic testing done if the insurance won't pay for it. Sometimes it can be a less expensive option for some of these tests than doing more of a clinical test that you may get done by a genetic counselor or a physician. And if you're just kind of interested in traits and wellness and some of the funky products that some of these laboratories are offering, there's some level of fun and entertainment value with some of these at-home genetic tests as well. And for people that really are interested in genealogy and ancestry, it can help connect people with their heritage or distant or lost family members. However, with these at-home tests, there are some risks as well. So the first I already briefly discussed is that it's not really complete testing. So with the genotyping type of test, it is not a full evaluation of the genes that are on the direct-to-consumer test. With consumer-directed testing, you're not necessarily getting all the genes that are linked to that condition. There's a risk of misinterpretation. So by ordering your own genetic test and getting a report in front of you that potentially says there may or may not be a risk, sometimes people can misinterpret what those results mean. And that can lead to medical risks where maybe a physician is ordering a test that's not really needed. And there can sometimes potentially be psychological risks where if somebody thinks that they're at high risk for a disease, but they've misinterpreted the result, maybe they're actually not. Or another potential psychological downside of this testing is I talk to a lot of people who, for instance, aren't aware that some of these tests are looking at Alzheimer's disease, and the results come back and they're shocked that they may be at increased risk and they weren't really anticipating that. The other issue that can kind of come up, and it's not so much misinterpretation, but I have this word penetrance in quotes. Penetrance is a genetics term that is used to describe the likelihood that somebody will go on to get a disease if they're found to have a mutation in a gene. And with some of these genes, the chance of developing that disease is not 100%. For instance, some genes associated with breast cancer risk may only impart a 20% lifetime risk of getting breast cancer, which means more women than not probably won't get it than will, whereas other genes may have a 60 or 80% chance or likelihood that a woman may get breast cancer. So there's this issue of penetrance in what your actual disease risk is that can sometimes also be potentially misinterpreted. Sometimes people may act inappropriately on the results, so maybe making changes to diet or medication or other lifestyle that really isn't truly indicated by the results. Or as I mentioned just a few moments ago, sometimes it can lead to unnecessary screening tests that, again, may cost additional dollars and may lead to other incidental findings that kind of send somebody down a whole series of tests that ultimately end up kind of showing that nothing is really there. Talked about the risk of false positive or false negative results. And this next one really isn't a huge issue, but there's always kind of a chance for maybe cross-contamination or some chain of custody issues where, if you order some at-home tests for you and your partner, maybe your adult children, and you all get together and you're all kind of spitting into the tubes at the same time, there's some chance that maybe there can be some DNA contamination where your DNA gets in somebody else's tube and the results aren't as accurate as they possibly could be, or that with chain of custody, maybe something gets mislabeled and the results that you get back are not necessarily yours because they're, you and a family member switched tubes accidentally. And one risk that I wanted to specifically point out for people that are interested in ancestry testing is sometimes the results come back and the ethnic background or the heritage is not consistent with what the individual or family has believed. And sometimes that may have people questioning their identity a little bit. Other times, ancestry tests can bring to light unknown or undisclosed family relationships. So with this testing, you may find out that a family member is not a biological family member, or that potentially you have half brothers or half sisters out there that you didn't know about. And in very rare instances, sometimes this genetic testing can identify that somebody was the product of an incest or a rape, which again was not shared and all of a sudden comes to light. So while most ancestry testing is relatively harmless, I think these are some things that people need to think about before just going on and doing it. And so talking about the risks and benefits really is a great lead into discussing the importance of genetic counseling as part of the at-home genetic testing process. So, I'm a little bit biased, but I really strongly encourage people to meet with a genetic counselor before doing genetic testing. Meeting with a genetic counselor, we can really sit down and discuss your motivations for wanting to do the genetic testing. What information are you specifically looking for by doing testing? A genetic counselor can review your personal and family history and perform a risk assessment. And by doing this, they may be able to help you what may be the best genetic test to consider. Or if the concern that you have maybe really can't be addressed with a genetic test, a genetic counselor can sit down and really discuss the risks, benefits, and limitations of testing like we've kind of gone over in this discussion this evening. Can spend some time explaining how the genetic test may impact your own health and the health of your family, and review any insurance issues associated with the genetic test. So with health insurance, can will your health insurance company cover the cost of genetic testing? And with any genetic testing, there's state and federal laws that protect against any kind of health insurance discrimination from occurring with a genetic test. But some states don't necessarily have protections for other types of insurance, like life insurance or long-term care. So a genetic counselor can really kind of talk to you about some of those insurance issues depending upon where you are located in the country. And once the results come back, whether you met with a genetic counselor beforehand or now you just have results in hand, a genetic counselor can sit down with you and really review the results. So if there is a finding in the result, a genetic counselor can spend some time discussing, well, first, whether or not a confirmatory test is needed. And a really important example here is that when the FDA gave approval for 23andMe to report out the BRCA1 and 2 Jewish mutations, they also recommended that if somebody has a positive result, that a second test be done in a different laboratory to confirm that the results are real. While 23andMe showed that the test is very accurate, it was not 100% accurate. So meeting with a genetic counselor after a 23andMe test, if the BRCA1 and 2 results are positive, we can have that discussion about what's involved with doing a confirmatory test. Or another issue, again, that we discussed is the raw data. If you've taken that raw data, uploaded it, have a report, we can sit down and have a conversation about whether or not the finding that shows up on this report is real or not, and whether another confirmatory test is needed. We could talk about any changes to any medical management that may be relevant after some sort of finding, some sort of positive finding on an at-home genetic test, as well as the implications and testing recommendations for other family members that may be associated with these findings. And also, having a discussion about what the positive findings mean for you as an individual and kind of what you're feeling and thinking about those positive results. Even if there isn't anything relevant or the results come back negative, we can still perform a risk assessment to determine if medical management may still need to change. If you took the test looking for a risk of, let's say, colon cancer, and the results came back normal, but you still have a strong family history of colon cancer, you may still qualify for undergoing increased screening or starting colonoscopies at an early age. So with negative results, there still can be some impact on your health and your medical management just based on your family history or your personal history. So again, a couple of examples of that is with the BRCA1 and 2 test results, if you did it because you wanted to know about your risk of having a mutation in those genes and you're not of Jewish ancestry, we can talk about, well, we really need to do a different test to assess that. Or another example may be, let's say you did the 30 gene cardiac panel at color, and your family history is suggestive of a hereditary cardiac disease, but the gene that we think may be causing it wasn't on that test. There may be a reason to, again, think about doing another genetic test. We can offer you psychosocial support. So again, sometimes it's good to be able to talk about these results with an unbiased party, where there may be difficult issues that you're not sure how to address. How do you share these results with your family members? Things that we can kind of help you with and walk you down that road. We can connect people with advocacy or support groups. So as a genetic counselor, we can really give you information about whatever condition it is and provide you some psychosocial support, but we're not necessarily living with that condition and don't know exactly how it impacts day-to-day life, family relationships. And sometimes it's good to talk to somebody else that's really kind of walked down that road because they're living it as well. Or again, connecting you with the needed medical professional. So if the results identify a risk, we can get you connected with the doctors that need to do the screening or the testing that would be warranted based on that condition. So if this is something that you've been thinking about or something that you've already done, and you really, after hearing all this, really want to speak to a genetic counselor, I would suggest going to NSGC's webpage, findageneticcounselor.com. You can search by zip code, you can search by state. There's lots of different ways to find a genetic counselor near you, or if there isn't somebody near you, there's different telemedicine options as well. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention this evening. There's a few ways to get a hold of me if you have some specific questions. And with that, I think we'll open it up to questions from the group.
All right. Thank you so much, Scott. I wanted to remind all of our attendees, as I saw a few people pop up over the course of the introduction and presentation, that we do have time for questions and answers right now. If you are interested in asking Scott a question, please go to the chat box and click on the question and answer tab, and you can type in a question and we will be reading those to Scott. Please note that by submitting a question, you are consenting to have that information read aloud during the presentation. So please don't submit any personal identifiers in the chat box. I'm going to get started with a couple questions. So Scott, you mentioned that, excuse me, you mentioned that the 23andMe BRCA testing is really only informative or helpful if you're Ashkenazi Jewish. If my Ancestry test says that I'm a small part Jewish, does that mean that I can use the BRCA testing?
So that's a great question, and that's a difficult one to answer. Generally speaking, if somebody is just a small part Ashkenazi Jewish, it's probably best to do the full BRCA1 and 2 test just to make sure that we are not missing something related to your non-Jewish ancestry side of the family. For somebody who knows that all four of their grandparents are truly all Ashkenazi Jews and somebody is 100% Ashkenazi Jewish, the 23andMe test is a very reasonable test to start with.
Great. I have a question about privacy. How much should I worry about the privacy and security of my data on websites like this?
Okay, so again, another good question. All of the direct-to-consumer companies, as well as the consumer-directed companies, when you go through the terms and conditions, the vast majority of them discuss that they do not release your information without your consent. They will not sell your identified data, and they do offer you the opportunity to participate in research, but that's something that you have to opt in to. There's been a lot in the news lately about law enforcement using people's DNA from websites. And the difference here is that what may not be clear in some of these stories is that the websites that law enforcement have been going to and using people's DNA are websites that people have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information into. So this is not law enforcement working with these at-home genetic testing companies. So I feel pretty confident telling people that your data is pretty well protected when doing these at-home tests.
Perfect. Okay. You mentioned the findageneticcounselor.com. If I can't find a genetic counselor that's in my area that specializes in at-home testing, what can I do?
So if you can't find one, when you go to the Find a Genetic Counselor, there actually are two options. One says in person, and I think the other one says by phone, if I'm remembering correctly, Erica. So if you click the option that says by phone, it should bring up genetic counselors that are connected with telemedicine companies, where you could speak to a genetic counselor in the comfort of your own home and just get it through a separate company. So even if there isn't somebody local, our website should be able to direct you to somebody that you could find via telemedicine.
Great. And I think you talked a little bit about this, but I've seen options for matching with family members that are on these platforms. Are there any risks of doing that?
So, some of the risks in terms of matching with family members, again, it could potentially identify very close relatives. So potentially like a half sibling or maybe a half aunt or uncle that may potentially bring up a form of infidelity in a family, for trying to say this as politely as possible. So that can come up. Let's see, in terms of matching, I don't deal a lot with the Ancestry testing directly and some of the companies that do the matching. I don't know, Erica, can you think of any other potential risks with doing some of the matching stuff that I'm just not thinking of?
No, I think that maybe finding some unexpected information is definitely one of the big ones. There have been a few stories about that. I will say that in some cases, that's actually considered a really big benefit to doing this type of testing. A lot of the people that we hear from who are most interested in learning about Ancestry or looking to see if they have connections really are doing it because they're adopted or they have missing family history information on one side of the family. So for people who are actually seeking out relatives, these tools can be really fantastic and great ways to try to reach out to people. Obviously, anytime you're doing something like that, for some of the reasons that Scott mentioned, that can be met with different challenges. But there, certainly have been a lot of stories about adoptees and others who really found a lot of great information. And it can also be a great time to start thinking about your family medical history and learning as much as you can, and then thinking about sharing that information that you learned from your physician, with your physician or genetic counselor. All right. Well, I think we are wrapping up with questions. Again, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us tonight. We really appreciate you taking time out of your evenings, and we hope this has been helpful and informative to you. If you do have questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me and Scott. We're happy to talk with you more about any of these issues. And as I mentioned earlier, this webinar will be recorded and be available on our Genetic Counselors and You webinar series page. So if you want to come back and listen to it again or try to pick up a little bit more, you can certainly do that. Thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. Thank you, Scott, for doing so much great teaching tonight. And we hope you'll join us for our next webinar. Thank you.